Hello everyone, it's Elizabeth from the Smart Stitcher. In this week's video we are going to be sewing our mittens together. I'll show you the needles and threads that I'm going to use, and then I will show you the order with which to put your mitten together and then how to finish it at the end. So let's get into it. To sew my mittens, I'm going to be using a Betweens number 5 needle. Now, normally if I was working on a thinner leather, I would use a Betweens number 7, and then to tack, I would use a Betweens size 10. Now, I'm going to stick with the size 10 for the tacking because that's nice and fine, and the tacking isn't a permanent stitch. Because I'm using, for this particular glove, I'm using a Gutermann's Mara thread. Let me show you. And this is a really nice strong thread that has been used. I've seen it used in shoemaking, but it's really comes in some really nice colours, and it's also really strong. Where the shearling is that little bit thicker, I need a needle that can go through the shearling without sort of bending, but also it can cope and take the thread through without the thread sort of shredding and breaking as it goes through the skin. So I've done a little bit of a practice, and it's probably a little bit tricky to see, but I've practiced with 1 strand and with 2 strands, and I think I'm going to stick with using the 2 strands. So at the end here, and this is why it's always a really good idea to practice, I can see that my single strand stitches just look a bit kind of skinny really, perhaps not quite as bold as I'd like them to, and they're also fairly uneven, so there's no way I'd want those on my mitten. And I can see where I've changed over, I've added in the second thread. Now you might not sort of notice much difference, but I do sort of feel that that's a little bit thicker. I can see from the little bit of practice I've done, I've got my eye in much more, and the stitches are a little bit more sort of smoother and regular. So I'm going to be sewing my mitten. When I actually sew it properly, I'll be using 2 strands of the Gutermann's Mara in a Betweens number 5, and then for my tacking I just use a normal sort of polyester sewing thread, and that's just to hold everything together to stop the leather from sliding, because the last thing you want to do or to have happen is to be folding your glove in half and then you realize that it started to walk its way down, which is always a bit of a danger with leather, and particularly where you've got a pile, it can shift as you're sewing it. So we want to make sure that it's nice and secure. So in terms of estimating the amount of thread that I need, I'm going to be starting my sewing with the thumb piece, and I'm going to be starting on this edge here, and then so I'm going to sort of be quite generous and just sort of walk my thread round. If you do kind of leather work, you'll know that it's sort of 4 times plus a little bit more if you're doing saddle stitch. We're not saddle stitching, so I wouldn't anticipate using that much. But what I want to sort of do is to sort of, okay, I'm coming down here, I will probably start a second thread, so I'm not going to need a massive amount, and you'll see why when we get sewing. So I'm going to sort of just very loosely kind of estimate, add on a little bit more, and then cut my thread so that I've doubled it and I've got a good length to stitch with. You may find that if your thread snaps, then you've got to sort of start and finish your thread again. Absolutely fine, keep going. When we put the thumb piece in, we'll be starting at this seam. This section folds in half, and then we will be sewing round to the bottom of this particular curve here. We'll then be putting it into the thumb panel on the actual mitten itself. So let's get started. So when our thumb piece is inserted, it's going to look a little bit like this one here, and we'll start, as I've mentioned, sewing here. We come all the way around, we'll then attach the thumb piece into the trank like so. To start off with, I'm going to fold my thumb piece in half, and I know that I want my stitches to come down to here, so I'm just going to use some sewing clips to help grip that together. Now I'm going to be sewing sort of somewhere between sort of 4 to 5 millimeters from the edge, so I'm going to make sure that my clips sit at a similar distance, so that if there are any marks on the leather from the clips, then they will just be absorbed by the stitches and sort of fairly disguised. I'm then going to come round, and I'm just going to pin these edges together with the clips, or clip them together, and what we're looking to do is to make sure that the fleecy side, the pile, is just sort of pushed to the inside before we sew it together. Now where we've removed some of the bulk, that's just made life a little bit easier, because without removing the bulk it just feels a little bit harder to sew through. So because we're sort of working on curves, I've added perhaps a few more clips than I might normally do if we were on a straight edge, just because I want to check that everything is completely leveled up. Now if you find that there's an edge that looks a little bit wonky, then by all means take a moment just to trim it before you start sewing. So now we've got the clips in position, I'm going to add some tacking stitches. Now if you've watched any of my other gloving stitches, the tacking gloving stitches and tutorials rather, the stitches are very similar. So I'm just literally going to be taking the needle through on where I'm going to be stitching, and this is where it might also be handy to have a pair of pliers to help pull the needle through if you do get a bit stuck or if your hands are a little bit tired. So I've pulled it through, I've left the tail, the thread, and then I'm just going to tie a knot. Now our tacking stitches we will snip out when we are actually meeting them when we're sewing. Other than that, we'll just pop them in, and this will just help keep everything nice and steady, make sure that our allowances are all where we would expect them to be, so that nothing can slip and slide during construction. I'm using a thimble on the end of my finger because that's going to be quite important in helping me move everything through as I'm sewing. And I'm probably going to put a stitch in between every clip, just because I'd like to know that everything is nice and secure. So I shall come back and I shall show you when that's done. So I've finished tacking the first part of putting the thumb together, and I've got the sort of the suede side of the sheepskin facing me. The fleece of course is on the inside because we want that sort of to help our thumb feel nice and warm. The good news is that the other thumb piece gets completed in exactly the same way. So there's no sort of difference, no sort of mirroring of anything like that. You will just need to tack that in the same way, and then we're going to start sewing. Going to start my thread off in exactly the same way as I have done in my earlier videos. I've gone through, let me show you, we're going to go through the inside of the leather. So I tend to sort of make sure that I always sort of come towards the outside of the leather so that the tail is always towards the inside. I've put the needle through the leather but not enough to see it, so I've sort of gone through and I've dug into the leather but not enough to come out to the other side. So I'm going to pull that and I'm going to leave a tail, and then I'm going to just repeat that again. Now it's quite much thicker leather, so I can always sort of just go to the side and go through a slightly different point. And now I'm going to pull my thread through. Because I'm working with 2 loops, we want to make sure that the threads are pulled tight. And before I pull the loop down, I'm going to take my needle through, a bit like doing a buttonhole or a blanket stitch, and I'm going to pull the thread tight. Now I can see that that has settled quite nicely. I will give the tail a little bit of a tug, and I'm going to split the end on the tail and just pull each strand to make sure that that is nice and tight. I'm then going to cut the threads off without cutting my main thread, because that's really infuriating if you do that. And then I'm going to just gently hammer that little knot so that it flattens out and it sort of sits, because if you were to feel it now, it's quite uncomfortable and you would notice it if you're wearing the gloves. What I'm going to do is just to hammer it flat, and already I can feel that that is much flatter. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is just make sure that our fleece is all pushed to the inside, and we're going to start sewing. So I'm going to bring my needle out, and I want to do my back stitch like I've done in my other videos. So I'm going to come out from the inside to the outside, and I'm going to start my pre-stitch. So I just want to make sure that all my pile and all my fleecy bits are on the inside, and then we can start sewing. So I'm going to go probably about 4 mils from the edge, so a little wider than if I was doing a sort of more of a thinner fashion style glove, and a fraction longer as well. So I'm making sure that my first stitch I'm doing is a back stitch, and I've got my threads pulled nice and level, If you're pulling your threads and the leather starts to wrinkle, you know that you've pulled your threads too tight. You want your threads to be nice and flat. So I'm then just going to work my way along, and I find it quite handy to flip over to the back as I'm then working out where to put my needle in, because I like to sort of maintain a consistent stitch length and a consistent gap. So I'm now working my pre-stitch. I'm going to be going from side to side, checking that my stitches are flat, and then I am going to be working my way along the glove. Let me just show you a couple more stitches. So we're going, it's a bit like doing a running stitch really, but perhaps just pulling it a little tighter. And where we've waxed the thread and where we are using a much stronger thread, it will cope with the resistance that the slightly thicker sheepskin is going to sort of put up with your sewing. So we go through, oh, now we've got a slight knot that's formed there, so we can just straighten those out with our needle, and then we'll just carefully pull them so they're nice and flat. If you do get any wrinkles, just take a moment to ease them out before you do the next stitch. Other than that, we are now tacking. We're not tacking, we're sewing. We're sewing this all the way around until we reach the end of this curve here, because we're then going to be stitching it into the trank. So I've got my thumb piece ready to be inserted into the trank, and as I've gone round, I've noticed that there are a few points where the pile or the sheepskin has just sort of crept out a little bit. So all I'm going to do is just with my small leather scissors just go along and just give those a little bit of a trim, and I can remove any kind of bits that are poking out and just to tidy up the edges. So there's a few kind of random strands that have escaped, and there's a few just sort of approaching the curve here, so I can just almost sort of pull the thumb slightly back on itself, and then that almost creates a straight edge that I can then get in there and get around there to give it a bit of a trim. So there we go. So now the next thing is to get the thumb piece tacked into our trank. To start off with, I've added a couple of tacking stitches just to the top and bottom of my trank. Now I've found those points by folding my glove in half, and I've made sure that the line, the bottom line where the cuff is going to be straight and level, and then I've literally just rolled the fleece until I've got exactly sort of to the halfway point, and then I've tacked just by going through that single layer so that I know that that is the midway point, which is going to relate to the points that I'm going to create on my thumb piece in just a moment. So those two are my markers to help me get my thumb in. So the next step is to get the thumb piece ready. Now I've already got one piece of thread that's hanging, and that'll be one of my markers that meets the top of the thumb hole in the trank there. So I'm now going to just gently fold the bottom of the thumb piece all the way down to the halfway point, and then with my tacking thread I'm literally just sewing across the fold there to put a marker in, and then I'm going to just tie a little knot. Now these markers are to help me get the thumb piece lined up. They will come out when we add our sewing in. So I'm just doing a very quick knot, and then now what we're going to do is a little bit more tacking. So I'm going to use the thread that I've already got here. That's going to go up to my top marker, and I'm going to tack that in position up there. I'm going to line up my bottom markers so that they are both level, and I'm going to put a tacking stitch in there so that my thumb piece is held at the top and bottom. I'm then going to get my clips, and I'm just going to clip at regular intervals, probably maybe 2 on each side, so I've got 4 clips altogether, so that I can distribute the excess of the thumb piece, because I don't want wrinkles at one end. I want it nice and smooth around the section here. So let's get on with that. Right, so we've got the thumb piece clipped in. We're still tacked at the top and the bottom. I've used an extra clip just because I wanted to be certain that I'd got the excess of the thumb piece itself distributed nice and evenly, and I can see from where I've got it clipped that I have. So I've clipped it so that I can still see both of the raw edges, much like we've done on the current stitching on that thumb piece that we've just completed. So the next thing now is to tack, and I'm going to go around and tack, and because it's a curve, curves are a little bit deceptive, and sometimes you need to have extra stitches in just to make sure that everything is kind of matching up and you're not running the risk of your excess sliding where you don't want it to go. Now we're all tacked in, and I've pretty much got as many tacking stitches as I had clips in position. The next thing is I've just added a little bit of extra wax to my thread, and I'm now going to start sewing from the top of my thumb hole down and around my actual sort of trank section where they meet. I'm going to be joining another thread, so on this particular occasion I'm not starting with a back stitch. I'm actually just carrying on with my stab stitch as I go around. When I come to start my next thread, I will make sure that I do a back stitch, and I'll show you how that looks, because I don't want there to be a hole where the thumb piece and the trank meet. So I'm going to make sure that that is extra secure when I come and add my second thread. But for now we are just going to start sewing, and I'm probably going to go maybe an inch or two round and then stop and start my next thread off. I like to sort of try and work the stitches down and around sort of fairly evenly, so I'll do a little bit down here for maybe a couple of inches, and then, as I say, start the next thread. Something else that can help just keep an eye on your tension and whether or not you've got any movement in your leather is keeping an eye on the angle of your tacking stitches. Now if the leather starts to drag or things get caught, your tacking stitch will go at a slight angle. So if I use, for example, just exaggerate this a little bit, I can now see that my tacking stitch is sort of almost sloping from a sort of on a diagonal from the bottom left to the top right. So as you're sewing, just keep an eye on the angle of your tacking stitches, because if things start to slide, then you can use them as a bit of a guide to just help keep things so that the tacking stitch is always at right angles to the edges that it's walking, that it's crossing. So just keep an eye on that. If it's angled, it usually means that something's starting to drag. If it's straight, then keep sewing. Sometimes disaster does strike and a stitch comes out a little bit lower than you anticipated. At this particular point, don't panic. What we're going to do is we're going to take the needle back through. So I'm going to use the eye of the needle to hook under that last stitch that we've just made, and just to pull the thread up a little bit. Now I'm going to pull that and just keep pulling it back out, and what I would want to try and do is keep the thread nice and level in the needle, and as I'm pulling it back through, I just want to very carefully keep it nice and level at the point at which it meets the hole, and then just very carefully just pull it back through. And I'm happy with the hole on this side, so I don't want to pull it all the way out, but what I do want to do is pull the needle so that I can reposition it and put the stitch in so that I'm happy with the needle, so I can go back through that original hole, and then I can just come up a little bit higher, which actually gives me a much better position for my stitch. Now there is a slight hole there, so what I'm going to do is just gently massage that with my fingernail and my thumb from both sides, and we'll just work that back in so that the hole is disguised. So then we can just carry on sewing. Now I'm ready to start my second thread off, and this is a little bit sort of furry, so it might be slightly trickier to see, but this is my trank, and this section where I'm actually starting my thumb piece, my thread off, sorry, is actually on my thumb piece. You can also start it in the trank if you wish. I just find it easier to start in the thumb, and I'm going to do that same stitch again, pulling the thread through. I'm going to leave a tail, so it's the same starting stitch as I've used in all my other gloving tutorials, and we're just going to, before we close the loop, we're going to take the thread through and then pull it tight. Now this will give me that knot again, so what I'm going to do is to hammer that knot, make sure it's nice and flat. I've just pulled the tails off there, and I want to make sure that I am actually cutting off the right threads rather than the one I'm going to sew with. I can then just hammer that knot very gently and it will flatten out. There we go. Now this time we're going to be starting, and our back stitch is going to be the first stitch that we created when we stitched down to the left hand side of the thumb piece here. So I'm very carefully just going to make sure that I'm going through the same holes, and I'm going to come up basically on the right hand side of the stitch, go down on the left, but when I come down I'm angling my needle so that I will come out onto this right hand side in order to carry on sewing. So I shall get the first stitch lined up and then show you what that looks like. So I've just turned this upside down, so this is the top of my glove here. I've come out on that sort of very last and first stitch we did, and then I've now angled my needle, so I've gone back in the other side of the stitch to do my back stitch. I've then come out in the trank, and I can take the tacking stitches out in just a moment, but I've come out sort of continuing my stitch pattern. Now I am going to continue sewing and keeping the pattern of the stitches, but I don't want this sort of other side of the thumb piece to kind of have any risk of it becoming loose or having a hole. So I'm actually going to do another little back stitch. So I'm going to make sure that my edges are completely level, and again I've got some of the pile escaping, so we'll just push that down and in. I'm going to come out and go like you're going to make a stitch. I'm going to come out and go back on myself, so I'm going to bring that through so it looks like an ordinary stitch from this side, and then I'm just going to turn it round, because I find that going backwards with a back stitch, I'll show you in just a second, it gives you that little bit of security to make sure that everything is going to be held in place. So I've then gone back on myself to sort of bring this element down a little bit further, to sort of give it some added security. So I can just pull that through, and hopefully now, yeah, I'm happy with that. We've got a couple of back stitches just holding either side of that seam in place. That's given us a little bit of extra strength, and then I'm now going to work my way around, probably doing another couple of inches of stitch just like I did on the other side. So eventually what I would like to do is work my way down with both sides coming down, and ideally meeting sort of towards the bottom. Sometimes you may find that if you've got a shorter thread, you may find yourself starting a new thread in order to do that. I find it easier to do my finishing stitches towards the bottom, because we overlap on when we finish the threads off, and that just adds a little bit more security to the base of the thumb piece here. So if I turn that round, basically means we're coming down both sides, allowing for an overlap at the base, and that just gives you a bit of extra security at the base of the thumb there. So I'm going to finish my thread off. So I'm going to finish this thread off. It's looking a little bit dark now, and I know that I haven't quite got enough to get down. So I'm going to finish it off now, start my new thread, and I'm going to then carry on the sewing. I'm going to start my new thread first, and I'm going to start in exactly the same way as we've done all of our other starting stitches, making sure that you are going into the leather but not coming out on the right side of the leather. And then we're going to make our loop and then cut off our excess and hammer our knot flat. So keep going through. Now once I've hammered my knot, what I'm going to be looking to do is to bring my needle out in the stitch that I am currently trying to make with my other thread. So what that's going to look like is I shall just hammer this first, and so I've done the starting stitch kind of within the seam where the knot will kind of sit with all the other stitches, and we'll just hammer that down. And we can always give it an extra hammer when we've finished sewing as well, just to help keep it nice and smooth. So I'm now going to be looking to bring my thread out through the hole where my old thread, which I'm about to finish, is currently sat. So I'm sort of fairly happy that I've got that coming out, and I'm now going to pull that out, check for knots on the other side. Sometimes this does happen, so it's always good practice just to check the back if you have had loops, just to make sure that everything is nice and flat, and then we'll turn our attention to the front. So I've got my new thread, and what I'm going to do now is I'm going to leave my new thread hanging, and I'm going to make a sort of a stitch with my old thread, but I actually want to just go through the first layer of leather and then bring it out on the inside to finish the thread off. So I'm going to keep within my sort of stitch and sewing pattern, but this time I'm just going through. So if I bring it out, hopefully you can just see that I am just through the one layer of leather. I'll come out on the reverse because that's where I'm going to do my finishing stitches. So there will be a sort of a one stitch overlap here, but that's absolutely fine in terms of making sure that we can finish the thread safely and securely. So I'm just going to check, because I know that I'm at risk of my loops. So I don't want to pull it really tight. I just want it to sit a bit like the others have done against the surface. And then I am going to do my finishing stitches. Now, sometimes you might find that you can see perhaps one of the other stitches here that you can slip under. Sometimes that's quite useful to be able to do that, so I can go under a couple of times and then I can finish my thread off, pull that nice and tight and cut that excess off. I will just give it a little quick hammer, and then I can resume my stitching with my new thread. So again, making sure that's nice and flat, give it a nice hammer. Again, that really does make a difference, and we will have a final hammer when we have completed the actual mitten itself. So we're now going to continue our stitching, and I'm going to go through that stitch that I've just started, that sort of half effect stitch, but this time I'm going right the way through to the other side to continue my stitching. Now I'm going to have that overlap I mentioned earlier will be towards the base of the thumb, so I want to bring both my threads down now so that I can then overlap them and finish them off. I've now reached the point where I'm ready to start finishing my threads, and I've been able to bring my threads down the sides, just adjusting my stitch length so that I can now overlap them. So what I'm going to do with the right thread, I'm going to go through the holes made by the left thread. So I'm going to go make a stitch, and then I'm going to just do a couple of stitches more, and then I'm going to finish my thread off, and I'll show you how to do that. Once I've done that thread, I will then take the left thread over to the right and just repeat that process so that both threads are finished off. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take that right thread through. Now I want to use the holes of the left thread, so I'm going to go like I'm making a stitch, and I'm going to go right the way through, coming out on the other side. So I'm going to do that, pulling that nice and tight. Just keep an eye that it doesn't knot, because that would be really frustrating at the point where you're finishing your thread off. So we're now just going to pull that through, make sure both threads are nice and flat, and then I can just look at the holes, and then I can go back through for a couple more stitches. So I want to come out in the same place if I can, because otherwise you'll end up with a stitch that'll be slightly above or slightly below. So the same place, keep the threads nice and level. Two threads is a bit of a thing, just to make sure that they are nice and level and there's no knots or loops. So I'll show you this one. So I'm going to do one more stitch, but this time when I come back the other way, I'm not going through both pieces of leather, I'm going through just the first layer and coming out in the middle of the glove. So I'm going to just slide my hand in here to help with this process, and I'm going to go from my thumb piece through the hole, and there's a bit of wiggling and manipulation here, so I want to come out nice and close to my stitches, and I can just see that our needle's coming out there, so I'll give that a bit of a push. and then pull our threads through, making sure that everything is nice and straight. Now we're on the inside, so I'm going to sort of keep traveling in the direction that I would have been going in, which will be coming up here, because my thread, remember, it's sort of now reversed, so I'm going to go up that side. And I want to, now this can be really tempting to just really pull the sheepskin apart to see the stitches, and it can help a little bit just to stroke the needle along, because we're going to try and finish the threads in exactly the same way that we've started. And if you pull too hard on your leather, you will actually end up, it'll start to pull the stitches out, and there holes will appear and it will weaken it. So as much as possible, try and avoid doing that. Now where I have separated the pile, so I've used my thumbnail and I've separated the pile, I can just see a couple of stitches, so I'm going to just hook under those, and I'll probably go under 2, and then I'm going to finish my thread off. So I've gone under a couple of stitches, keep my ends nice and secure, make sure that my threads are flat, and then I'm going to go under one of the stitches. And so finishing in the same way that we've started, the same stitch, pulling that loop nice and flat, pulling the threads nice and tight. Now because it's on the inside, I'm going to just expose another stitch or so, or find the inside of the leather, and I'm just literally going to flatten that out, run that along, and I can see the stitches. So if you can't quite see the stitches, the leather is quite thick, so you can always go like you're going to do a starting stitch. I find it quite useful once I've done that finishing knot to just run my needle through so that my ends are sort of fairly secure when I cut the thread off. So I've pulled it through, I've gone through the leather, and then I'm just going to cut that thread off, and then I can hammer that flat to make sure that my area is secure and the knot is reduced. And then now all I'm going to do is take the left thread to the right for another couple of stitches, and then repeat that process so that this thread is then finished. Once our thumb is completed and hammered, we're then ready to sew the rest of the mitten together. As you are looking at your mitten, if you happen to notice that there is any sort of odd bits poking out, just eyeball them and give them a bit of a trim. And then once you're happy, we're going to fold the glove over. Now we want to make sure that the base of the glove is nice and level, so I'm going to sort of pull that over, make sure that my edges are lined up, and then I'm going to pop some clips on. Now because the sheepskin has got a little bit of resistance with the pile there, I'm going to just put my first couple of clips quite close together. Now I'm then going to be working my way along, and I want to sort of keep everything nice and balanced and nice and straight. With a pile, you can sometimes find that it wants to shift as you're working and sewing it. So I know that my top and bottom need to line up, so I'm going to start those off and pop the clips on and work my way around. Now where you've often got a curve, sometimes you find that you might sort of be a little bit closer together. You might not necessarily be putting a tacking stitch there, but you will be using the sort of clips to help keep everything stable. So sometimes it's better to have a few more on a curve than sort of have too many kind of gaps. So you're going to work your way around, and then we're going to finish the clipping, and then we're going to start tacking. Personally, I find it quite helpful to sort of clip your finger end and then clip the side and gradually sort of work towards a sort of middle point. I find that just helps me to keep any sort of excess nice and balanced, so that the glove doesn't start to distort or look slightly like it's sort of slightly not lined up correctly. So if your glove is starting to sort of have any particular drag or any pull in any direction, you've got some very definite diagonal lines, then you'll know that something is wrong. So I've now clipped everything together, and I'm happy with how that's lined up and how that is sitting. So we would expect, as it goes from a sort of a 2-dimensional to a 3-dimensional form, you are going to get some shaping and the sort of leather starting to come to life. Don't worry about that, that's what we want. But our diagonal lines and anything that is dragging and looking like it's stretching isn't a good thing. So now we're going to tack, and it's tacking like we've done before. I'm going to move my clip out, and then I'm just using my size 10 needle with my tacking thread in, and I'm just pushing that through, and then I'm going to tie a knot with it. Now, much like with my sort of working on a curve, oh, I've just pulled that out, that's not ideal. Don't let go of your end. We want to make sure that we are holding it securely as we start to sew. The reason I'm tacking it is because what I don't want to happen is for it to start moving. So I'm going to leave a slightly longer tail this time, and we're going to tie that together like so. So I'm going to work my way around, and it can be a reef knot, a granny knot. There's no particular preference here, as long as it's knotted together and you're not trying to pull the thread out of the leather with your knot, so the knot sits kind of cuddling the leather rather than trying to pull a hole through it. So without it slipping out this time, we go through the leather. I'm going to leave a longer tail to prevent it from coming out, and then we are just going to fold that around, give it a bit of a knot. Now you will notice it's not going to lie completely flat because of the pile, and you will have points where also because of the pile it looks like there might be a gap or an issue, but as long as you've pinned it you will have that extra bit of bulk. But because we've trimmed the seam, when you actually stitch it together, it's going to sit together really well. So the next thing to do is just to carry on and tack everything. I'll probably leave probably about a gap that I've got there all the way around, just because I don't want anything to start sliding. We're now all tacked, and we're at the point where we are ready to start sewing the seam. Now it can be really tempting to say, just do it in one long length of thread, and some of what I'm about to say now may well depend on how the thread you're using is stitching. I've already stitched the right hand glove, and I found that if I decided I was going to do it in one long length, then that is a lot of thread to be going through quite a thick leather. So I actually ended up starting at one thread at the top and working my way down, starting another thread at the bottom and working my way up, so that I then overlapped somewhere near the point where you're sort of, if you were to squeeze your hand together, that sort of might bulge out a little bit more. So I want to overlap there because that's often an area that might just need a little bit of reinforcement. So what I'm going to be doing is starting one thread up here, and I'll work my way most of the way round. I'll start the other thread towards the bottom here and work my way up, and then I will aim to work this one, bring that one down a little bit further, bring that one up a little bit more, and then overlap somewhere in the middle. When I start my thread off, I'm going to be doing exactly the same stitch where I go into the bite into the leather a little bit, do my knot, and then start sewing. So one of the reasons I don't do my tacking stitches too close to where I'm going to start, or I always leave a little gap, is so that I can get in there and just do my starting stitch and stabilize where I'm going to sew first. So if I press that down, pull that back, so we don't want to sort of stretch too much, but we do want things out the way so we can do our starting stitch. So I'm going to go under and bite into the leather, and it's just like we've done before, keeping the ends nice and straight, making sure that they behave themselves, leaving your tail, and then we're going to just go through either the same hole or through the nearby. Before we pull the loop tight, take the needle through, and we're going to pull a knot and make that nice and flat. Once I've given that a hammer and I've pulled it nice and tight, I can then start sewing. So cutting the ends off, and do at this point make sure that you're not cutting your thread, because that is really annoying. So ends away, quick hammer, and then we shall be underway. I'm now ready to start my back stitch, and I've got my starting stitch on the inside, I've hammered it flat, and I'm now bringing it out in order to start sewing. And we're using exactly the same type of stitch again, and this time we're starting with the back stitch. I'm keeping an eye on my tacking stitches, because if they start to go on the diagonal, I'll know that I'm sort of dragging, or I've got a problem with the the pile moving as I'm sewing. So keep an eye on your tacking stitch, and again repeating the process that we used on the thumb piece. So I'm going to go back on myself and just keep an eye about where I come out, bearing in mind now that of course we want to keep our stitching so that it looks uniform in line with what we've already done. And we're just going to make sure that our threads are nice and flat, which they are, and then we're going to just basically now carry on sewing like we have done previously. So keep an eye on your stitch length and stitch gap, and you're basically just going to keep sewing. So get yourself a cup of tea and get your mittens underway. I'm at the point now where I've just started my second thread at the bottom here. I've started in exactly the same way on the inside, and I've come out on the outside to do my back stitch. The only difference is because this is the end, and if you can imagine perhaps that this point is particularly vulnerable to possibly ripping, so I've added an extra stitch. So I've done my first back stitch twice, and I'm now going to carry on sewing, working my way up. And I'm going to, as I mentioned earlier, bring this one down, bring this one up, and hopefully they will overlap somewhere around the middle of the glove. As I've gone through my first stitch twice, I now need to do something slightly different so that I have a little bit of a gap between my stitches. So what I've done is I've gone through on the back, and I've gone through the same hole that as though I was going to make a stitch so that my needle is going into. And what I've done is, rather than come straight across to come out where the previous hole would have been, I've actually angled it so that I'm coming out to away from that previous stitch, as though I've sort of got a gap between my stitches. So I'm hoping that you can see that. If I hold it up, you can see that my needle has gone through at an angle. So I've angled my needle to go through that first hole on the same spot, but to come out slightly further away than that my previous stitch, so I can keep my consistent gap. I'm at the point now where I'm ready to do my finishing stitches. I'm going to be taking my right thread away to the left, and I'm going to be following the holes of the existing stitches for a couple of stitches before doing my finishing stitch. The finishing stitch is going to be exactly the same as the type of stitch we've used elsewhere on the glove, so that's nothing new. Rather than sort of keep turning my glove inside out, which of course you can do, you can finish one thread off, turn it the right way out to finish the other one, I'm going to get both my threads through to the inside and then just turn it inside out once to do my finishing stitches. So the first thing I'm going to do is to take my thread through, and I'm going to follow the stitches for a couple of stitches and then bring it out on the inside like we've done before, and then I'm going to do the same on the other side as well. We're now on to our finishing stitches. I've opened up the seam slightly and I've exposed just where I can see my stitches. So I've hooked under, I've put my needle under a couple of stitches, and I'm now going to pull that through, making sure that my loops don't get caught up and they stay nice and flat. I'm now going to do a finishing stitch under one of those stitches. So the last one I've come out of is the one I'm actually doing the loop for, and I'm going to just pull that nice and tight. I'm going to then just pull each thread individually to make sure that the knot is sat down within the seam, and then just to finish my thread off, I'm going to just run under the next stitch, make sure my threads are nice and level, which they are. And then I'm just going to pull the thread slightly whilst I cut it off, and then that'll, just by giving it a little tug like that, it'll help it then relax back into the seam. So that is one stitch finished. I'm then going to repeat that for the other side, and then my stitching is done. When you're hammering your seams after you finish stitching, you want to make sure that you're hammering onto something fairly solid. So if I was to take this away and just hammer onto the table, I might find that that bounces a little bit more than I would like, and my hammering isn't then as effective. So I've got here, it's a cobbler's last, but it's a fairly solid lump of metal. And what I've done is I've got a scrap piece of leather that I did some practice stitching on. I'm using that as a little bit of a barrier, because what I don't want to do is to sort of damage the leather against the last, but also I just want to make sure that everything is protected. So then I've got a sort of a sandwich, I suppose, with my scrap leather, and then I'm just literally going to hammer onto that surface. And you could even use a thinner piece of leather, it doesn't have to be the same as the leather that you've stitched, so that we can then see that we've made a difference within our seams. So just have a quick double check, run your fingers along your seams, anywhere where there is a bit of bulk or you can feel a knot, then just give it a little hammer to help flatten it out. To finish off, I'm now just going to go along my seams, and anywhere where there is some of the fur, some of the wool poking out, I'm going to give that a bit of a trim. So I'm just keeping my scissors nice and flat against the seam, and it's just very gently working my way along. Obviously I don't want to cut the leather, but I do want to just trim my edges a little bit more. So I'm really carefully just working my way along. I may find sometimes that I can sort of go one way and trim them, and then I'm almost coming back the other way and sort of turning them over. So it's just very carefully. I don't, as I say, I don't want to cut the glove itself, but I do want to give it a trim and just to sort of tidy it up and just take off some of those excess hairs. Now you may find that you've got a little brush that you can also brush off any bits of fluff that you've accumulated. I would say that when you're using wax, you want to sort of avoid getting as much wax as possible on the leather, so always sort of pick that off as you're working. But I also find it quite helpful just to use a little bit of what I call Scotch tape or magic tape, which is a tape with a slightly lower stickiness, but then that's also really good for getting sort of little bits of fluff off as well. And as I'm working on the leather, I do try and keep it so that it's not going to get contaminated by the cat or sort of pick up any particular marks. So sometimes just keeping it wrapped in a sheet or in a bag or a pillowcase can just sort of preserve it on the days that you're not working on it, and it also stops any family pets from deciding they may wish just to sleep on it as well. So I'm just going to finish these last bits, and then we're going to get the magic tape, as it's sometimes known, or Scotch tape, and we will just pick up any last bits of fluff. It can help as well just to go and have a really good shake of everything outside, and that will get rid of all those little bits of fluff. So we can get rid of those bits there, and then this is what it looks like in the UK, and it's just a tape with a slightly lower tack, and then you can just use that over your mitten to then sort of pick off any bits of dust. And if it's wax, obviously just try and get rid of it. Don't be tempted to sort of try and rub it into the skin there. And that then brings us to the end of our tutorial. The last thing you may wish to consider, now with the mittens that I've made here, I've got the option of rolling the cuff down, or I've got the option of keeping the cuff turned up. So if you may wish to keep that for your mittens. If you know that you're someone that doesn't like to roll the cuff down, you may well find it useful just to do a little bit of a hemming stitch, which I'll show you in just a moment, to keep the cuff into position. But that may well just be personal preference as well. So just keep an eye, make sure you've got all your bits off, and then if you're going to hem, hang on, because I'm going to show you how to do that. When you're ready to hem, you want to make sure that you're happy with the distance of the cuff all the way around. I've put a few tacking stitches in mine with my yellow thread just to hold the cuff, because what I don't want to happen is for me to be sewing it and the hem starts and it starts shifting against itself. So I've just got 3 or 4 tacking stitches in there, holding it at sort of key points so that I know that it's not going to move or distort. I've started my thread by turning the cuff to the inside, starting the thread in the same way. And the type of stitch that I'm doing, I will just sort of show you, and I'm going to just zoom in a little bit so that's a bit easier for you to see. So to start sewing, I've brought my thread out in the cuff. I'm then going sort of level with the edge of the cuff into the mitten itself, but I'm not going all the way through to the other side. So I'm going underneath just so I can tuck my needle in, and I hope you can just sort of see that on camera there. I'm then going to angle it and bring it out in the cuff. So I'm probably about 8 to 10 millimeters away from my previous stitches where I've come out, and then I repeat. So I go through, bite into the mitten a little bit, and then angle the needle so I'm coming out in the cuff about a centimetre away, and I'm just going to repeat that all the way around. So your stitches will look possibly like little running stitches or little stab stitches, just holding the cuff against the glove, but you won't be seeing any stitches on the inside because you haven't gone deep enough into the leather. So if I can just move that round to show you, they will sit against the edge of the glove. Now obviously I've exaggerated it slightly because I'm pulling the fur away, and they'll sit against the edge of the glove, and then you will just, when you're finished, you work your way all the way around, finish your thread off very discreetly as close as you can to the edge of the cuff, and then you can just sort of bush it up and over so that your hemming stitches are nice and hidden. Thank you for watching this tutorial about how to make your mittens. I hope you've enjoyed watching along and that you are also enjoying sewing your own mittens as well. Just a final sort of couple of tips about looking after your mittens. If they get wet, please be careful when you are removing them, and you want to be easing them off your hands if they are wet. Allow them to dry naturally. Don't stick them on a radiator because that can make the leather go sort of a bit like cardboard, and it runs the risk of cracking. So always remember, and it's the same if you have mittens or other types of gloves, just ease them off so that they're gradually coming off your hand and not sort of getting yanked. Sometimes stitching can break, but you should be able to repair that quite easily, and just enjoy wearing them. I've left my cuffs without the hem on because I like to be able to sort of roll them down when it's really cold, but of course you can hem them and add any other extra details you wish. So thank you very much for watching, and enjoy wearing your mittens.